Hey everybody, and welcome to Manual Shooting. So every great videographer will tell you that the key to really shooting in your own style is the ability to manipulate the camera's controls so you can get the picture or the image that you want. Now, manual shooting is broken down into three key things that you need to adjust and amend in order to get the right look and exposure. So these are aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. So firstly, let's take a look at aperture. Aperture is simply the amount of light that's let into the lens of the camera. In the What to Look For in Lenses video, we talked about how different f-stops change the aperture of your lens. For example, an f1.8 lens will let in more light than an f4 lens, and this also contributes to the depth of field that you can see in the image or the background blur. Essentially, having a lower aperture in your image will boost the exposure and the brightness of the image, and also the lower the aperture, the more background blur you will get. Next is shutter speed. Shutter speed is essentially how fast the shutter in the camera snaps the picture. Generally, the rule of thumb with videography is you want your shutter speed to be double your frame rate, and this is because it syncs perfectly to what the human eye can see and essentially makes motion blur look more natural. This rule is one that you don't really want to stray away from, so if you're shooting in 50 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/100, and if you're in 25 frames per second, your shutter speed will be 1/50. Now don't get me wrong, there might be times where you will need to increase your shutter speed to more than your frame rate, but this just helps if you wanted to take still images from the video, as the footage will be a bit sharper. As far as examples go, look at me waving my hand. So you'll notice that at the moment, because I'm shooting this in 25 frames per second with a shutter speed of 1/50, the motion blur looks really natural. Now if I change my shutter speed to 1/160, you can see that it looks a lot more jittery and a lot less smooth. So look at these side by side and you'll be able to see what I mean in terms of the difference. Finally, you have your ISO. ISO simply bumps up the light in the image, so a lot of the time if you're shooting in low light, you may be tempted to bump the ISO up. But because the ISO literally will just bump up what's already there, you will notice that the higher the ISO, the more noise or artifacts it introduces into the picture. So right now I'm filming myself at ISO 125, which I like to use as it keeps noise to a minimum, and it's pretty much as low as my ISO will go. But I'm also using an artificial light, which is up there, and I'm using a low aperture, so there's a ton of light being let into the lens. Now I've turned the artificial light off and I've bumped up my ISO to about 1600, so you'll start to see that there's noise that's being introduced into the picture. Now this is not only annoying, but will reduce the quality of your video. So in some cases this can't be helped, I appreciate that, but wherever possible, try and keep your ISO as low as possible and invest in some artificial light. And we're back to normal. As far as artificial light goes, I would recommend the Neewer 660 LED panels, as these are only about £200 off Amazon, and these give off absolutely loads of light, so it removes the need in most situations to bump the ISO up. So those are the three main components to shooting in manual. Just to recap, change your aperture as needed for your desired picture, try and keep your shutter speed, double your frame rate, and try and keep your ISO as low as possible. There is also a great way when shooting manual to check how your image is exposed. Now I'm a Canon user, but I know Sony have an exposure meter on their cameras too. Now all you need to do when you're shooting is hold your shutter button halfway, and this will bring up the exposure meter. The exposure meter goes from -3 to +3 and lets you know how exposed your image is. This is fantastic, as it means you have quick reference to see if you need to increase your exposure by either using a lower aperture or a higher ISO, or if you need to decrease the exposure. Let's have a look at an example. So this example here, for example, is my passport, and as you can see, the exposure meter is telling us we're well underexposed. So first things first, we're going to change the shutter speed to double that of our frame rate, which is 25, so our shutter will be 1/50. Next, we're going to bring our aperture as far down as we can. Now on this camera and on this lens that I was using, the minimum aperture was f4, and we're finally going to put the ISO up, and as you can see, the exposure meter now shows in the middle, which means that this is relatively well exposed. Just bear in mind here that the camera is not always 100% correct, so sometimes it may show as if your subject is correctly exposed, but your subject might be too dark or too light. Now the exposure meter is not designed to be the be all and end all of exposure, it is just a guide. So if you notice that your subject is too under or overexposed, you can change the settings to suit it and correctly expose them. So that's it for shooting in manual, but if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.